theme, an aspirational approach to planetary and human futures. And it will look at how planetary pressures intersect with health, education, livelihoods, and well-being. To give us a formal welcome to this afternoon, I'm going to invite Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, Dr. Heather Ricketts, to greet us. Colleagues, let's welcome Dr. Ricketts.
Thank you so much, Professor Tanisha. And let me just say how much of a pleasure it is for both faculties, science and technology and social sciences, to get together around this topic, which is dealing with human development largely. So, distinguished colleagues, I am really very pleased to welcome you to this UNDP UWI Thought Leaders Roundtable, being hosted this afternoon for the express purpose of informing the UNDP's 2026 Global Human Development Report, now under development, and themed an aspirational approach to planetary and human futures. I want to especially thank Dr. Kishan Cody, the UNDP's resident representative, and Professor Dale Weber, our former principal, for inviting the partnership with the Faculty of Social Sciences to this first dialogue. In the social sciences, as I'm sure many of you would be aware, human development is something that we wrestle with in every one of our disciplines, from economics to sociology to political science to business and to management. We are engaging in this dialogue about planetary and human futures at what we would all agree is a very pivotal moment in history, characterized by unprecedented environmental change, technological transformation, demographic shifts, and deepening social inequalities. We are therefore compelled to ask and answer fundamental questions about the kind of future we are creating, for whom, and how societies can respond to the complex challenges that transcend even national boundaries or borders. I recall being a graduate student when the first Human Development Report was published in 1990, with its bold contribution of the Human Development Index, the HDI, and followed by 1995 by the introduction of the Gender Development Index and the Gender Empowerment Measure. Some of us were really very thrilled when those introductions came. The serious questioning of the true meaning of development had begun. It was a pivotal moment in history at that time as well, and a very exciting one. The World Bank had also been advancing its own development with a human face agenda, and it meant that economists and economics no longer held a monopoly on defining development, as conventional measures, particularly gross domestic product, GDP, had focused very narrowly on economic growth while neglecting broader aspects of human well-being. So you could imagine, for those of us who were sociologists, we certainly had our voice in the discussion. The HDI was revolutionary. It sought to provide a more comprehensive assessment of development by incorporating indicators of health, education, and income. This multidimensional approach advanced the idea that development should be evaluated in terms of expanding people's capabilities and opportunities, rather than merely increasing national wealth. For many of us, this represented a fundamental shift in development thinking. Today, in the context of the climate emergency, the UNDP is once again at the forefront of rethinking development. And I know that, we've seen other measures before this, the multidimensional index of poverty, etc. But in this instance, it is turning our attention to the relationship between humans and the planet and proposing an aspirational approach to planetary and human futures through the introduction of a new index, the Nature Relationship Index. Just as GDP eventually proved inadequate as a measure of development, the HDI by itself has become insufficient in an area defined by climate change. Human development is increasingly about survival, adaptation, resilience, and equity, not simply about living a long and healthy life or being knowledgeable and enjoying a decent standard of living, important though these dimensions remain. For Caribbean people, the inseparability of human resilience and planetary resilience is not a new idea. Even as we have depended on the exploitation of natural resources in pursuit of viable livelihoods, nature has never been an abstract concept for us. The sea has shaped our economies. It has shaped our migration histories, our cultural imagination, and our collective survival. Forests, rivers, reefs, coastlines, and agricultural lands have sustained livelihoods, tourism, food systems, community life, and even spirituality, the anthropologists will tell you. Rebalancing the relationship between people and nature will therefore require not only protecting ecosystems, but also using natural resources in more responsible and sustainable ways, transforming extractive relationships into thriving ones, and also ensuring access to things like beaches, which has become increasingly contentious in many of our countries in the Caribbean. Right here in Jamaica, for example, we have a grassroots advocacy group, JABEM, the Jamaica Beach Birthright Environmental Movement, and they are fighting for the right of ordinary Jamaicans to access the island's coastlines. And the argument is that colonial era laws and the expansion of private all-inclusive resorts have made only a tiny fraction of the nation's beaches accessible to locals. And Jamaica is not unique. So the dialogue we're seeking to have today is therefore a dialogue about the relationship between communities and livelihoods, between development and dignity, and ultimately between present and future generations. The climate crisis has challenged us to identify the policy choices, the institutional levers, the measurement tools, and collective action that can advance more just and livable futures for both our people and also the planet. Our recent experiences with Hurricanes Beryl and Melissa have reinforced the reality that weather events are simultaneously environmental, social, economic, political, psychological, and of course, developmental. These events expose and deepen existing vulnerabilities. And in a region where many countries continue to grapple with high levels of debt, high levels of poverty, high levels of youth unemployment, and the underdevelopment of human capital, also migration and brain drain, and fragile and underdeveloped social protection systems, conversations about planetary resilience inevitably become conversations about social resilience. Regenerative development, therefore, must address these interconnected challenges. We also know that many livelihood systems across the region are conducted in the open and remain highly vulnerable to climatic conditions. Large segments of our labor force are engaged in informal employment, often facing the daily realities of rain. How many people probably can't go out today? Heat, dust, storms, and economic insecurity. Climate vulnerability is therefore not simply an environmental one or concern, as I had indicated earlier. It is a question of livelihoods, equity, and social justice. Today's roundtable provides an important opportunity to reflect critically on these issues, and others, of course, to share diverse perspectives, and to explore pathways towards futures that enhance both human well-being and planetary sustainability. Given the distinguished panel of experts gathered here this afternoon, I am confident that our discussions will generate valuable insights, bold ideas, and actionable strategies for better aligning development with planetary health. So I look forward to a stimulating and productive dialogue. Before I take my seat, however, I just want to thank all of you who have agreed to participate in the dialogue today. Nadine, I see you from the Planning Institute. Thank you. Kevin from the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute. Judy from the Mona School of Business and Management. Professor Weber from the Faculty of Science and Technology. Our own UNDP's resident representative. And Dr. David Smith from the Institute for Sustainable Development, And of course, our own climate expert, Professor Michael Taylor, who at the moment is so, called on. Sometimes Michael, I have to say that I feel sorry for him because he is called on daily within the last, once a hurricane season begins, he is our man. So I just want to thank all of you who have agreed to participate today. We look forward to your voices. And I want to thank as well our Associate Dean in the Faculty of Social Sciences, Professor Lila Rao Graham. I want to thank Lila and Francesca, Mrs. Francesca Lloyd McDavid, our Marketing Officer, along with the UNDP's Gillian, is it Scott? Yes? I want to just thank all of you for the legwork in making today a reality. Thank you all. We look forward to a robust dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean, for those opening remarks. I'm often in settings where colleagues are fearful of following Professor Michael Taylor. It looks like the same is true in the social sciences. So I'm figuring my hypothesis is it's a Dean thing. All right. We're going to move to introductory remarks, colleagues. I'm going to be inviting Ambassador Dale Weber, Special Envoy on Climate Change, Environment, Oceans, and Blue Economy, to greet us, to give his opening remarks, and he will be followed by Dr. Kishan Cody, Resident Representative, UNDP Multi-Country Office. Colleagues, could we welcome Prof. Weber?
Thank you very much, Professor Stevenson, who is guiding us through today's exercise. So I see at least 3 heads, 2 deans, 1 res rep. Seems like you have a good collection going here. But welcome to you all, and thank you for participating and making yourselves available. The genesis of this discussion actually came out of Melissa. I met Dr. Cole, and we were having a discussion about how UNDP, through its many arms and activities, could assist the government of Jamaica as we were planning the rebuilding exercise. We went through a pretty arduous process and came up with a plan. And as we were beginning to lay out the plan, I thought, okay, I've done my job. I handed Dr. Kade over to Minister Samuda, job done, and I can move on. Then I get a phone call, and he says, so, we need to get some brainstorming together. We need to get some thought leadership. So a bell goes off in my head because of my previous hat. Whenever you say thought leadership, the first place I go to is the University of the West Indies. So we had a little discussion, and I said, well, I am not sure that I can once again connect, but the University of the West Indies is clearly the place that I would go to for this thought leadership. I promised to make a couple of calls and would get back to Kishan. Fortunately, the first call I made was to Dean Ricketts. Now, she don't like when I call her because the first call was one Saturday evening. You remember? When I'd asked her a couple of times when I was principal about being dean, and she says, no. Well, no. And we had a plan, and we went about the plan, and then the plan fell through. She didn't realize that she was my plan B, C, and D. So when I called her, I know she had this trepidation, but when I explained what was on the table, what we were trying to do, she very gladly accepted that this was something that the Faculty of Social Sciences would want to be involved in. I know it wasn't hard to get my faculty involved, because my dean is always, every day, all day, looking for a way for what we do to be relevant and in the face of all of Jamaica. So that was an easy part. But in doing that, you have stitched together two faculties which have a great propensity for thought process, but also for making things happen in terms of our end product. It happens at a time, however, which is important. We are right now, I noticed we're saying climate change, but we're actually going through what we call a triple planetary crisis, which is climate change, as well as biodiversity loss, as well as pollution. And all three of those are the result of human interventions. So when we plan our successes and plan our remediation, we need to bear in mind that climate change may be the overarching, but biodiversity loss and pollution are two other avenues that are making life difficult. And as you mentioned, your work in social sciences and what you do, there are a lot of things in people's lives that are affected by pollution, are affected by biodiversity loss, and causing the two things to happen. Well, the Ministry of Water, Environment and Climate Change is not a year old yet, and we're still trying to get it where we want it to go. But the Climate Change Advisory Board has been in continuation from 2015 after a 1996 initiation. But from 2015, that board has been operating, and today's exercise, today's discussion is clearly something which will attract the attention of the board. We have much to say, but we also have much to hear, and that's what a dialogue is about. The young, the very young, the old, and the very old are at the tip of the discussion here today. Many in the middle can fend for themselves, but those who are vulnerable need special attention, and I urge you to think about those. I urge you also to think about food security, since a hungry man is a hungry man, and empty bag can't stand up. Therefore, agriculture, water availability, when, where, and how become part of the discussion that I think we need to have. It is also important for us to think of where we are and what we contribute. Having been head of another entity where, again, the UNDP and the Environmental Foundation of Jamaica have struck an agreement and alliance to try and move forward, it is clear that new modes of funding and financing need to happen, whether it's blended, whether it's mono, or whether it's bi. There are certain things that need to happen, and I think we're in a position in this room with those gathered in the thought leadership to take that on board. The EFJ was started by a debt for nature swap. The Jamaican government or the US government so much money that they said, tell you what, take the interest and put it in the environment and you're off and running. And that has run the institution for 30 years. So we decided we need some more money. We went back for a debt for nature swap, and the government told us, interesting, we don't have any debt that we need to swap. There isn't enough debt in Jamaica to pull another debt for nature. I was trying a debt for climate swap, but it didn't really work. So we have to start getting creative in how we fund and how we finance. And I want that to be on the table as the great thought leadership comes on mind. And finally, I want to think about purpose and passion. I want it to be involved. I want it to be invoked. I want it to be innovative in how we think about the things that we're doing. Because when we, the able, are unwilling, we must say nothing when those who are less able but more willing do. Thank you.
So good afternoon, colleagues. Great to see everyone here at the University of West Indies and dozens of colleagues online. This is a very important gathering, and I want to start by thanking Dean Ricketts and the entire team at the Faculty of Social Sciences, Ambassador Weber, Prof. Taylor, Faculty of Science and Technology, our long-standing partners at Silicis in particular, our long-standing partners from government, PIOJ. It's really a pleasure to have everyone here with us today for this important discussion. The partnership between UNDP and UE this year marks 50 years. So 50 years ago, UNDP launched our multi-country office here in Jamaica, from where today we cover Jamaica, Bahamas, Belize, Bermuda, Turks, and Cayman. And over those 50 years, there's been success on success of collaborations in thought leadership, in cutting-edge research, in dialogues between civil society, international community, government on various priorities. And today's is definitely a key one in that chain of events, and one that will have a legacy going forward, I think, in terms of not just the 2026 Global Human Development Report, which is in focus for this consultation, but also our cooperation within Jamaica and small island development states in general. And so when I first had that discussion with Ambassador Weber, some amazing thought leadership from Prof. Taylor around previous COPs in terms of the nexus between climate and human development pathways, great discussions with our good friend David Smith from the Institute of Sustainable Development, Prof. Northover from Salises, and many others across UWI. I was thinking we really need to get the experience and insights and agency from our partners in the small island developing states to infuse this global report as being on the front line of this crisis, the planetary crisis. So as we've seen the last few years, we had Hurricane Beryl, a major event that had major impact, particularly in the eastern part of the Caribbean. Then we followed up with Hurricane Melissa, more impact in the western part of the Caribbean. Hurricane Melissa, as we know from our recent United Nations loss and damage assessment report, $12 billion of loss and damage in western Jamaica. About 60% of the nation's 2024 GDP, up to 60%, making it the biggest impact from a climate-induced disaster in 2025 and one of the most severe on record in recent years globally, with severe impact on multidimensional poverty as well. As we know, many communities that were the affected by Hurricane Melissa in western Jamaica, many of those parishes were already facing 15 to 20% multidimensional poverty rates. And of course, Hurricane Melissa, in the weeks and few months after Hurricane Melissa, that number increased significantly, with recovery efforts having been underway this year in particular for many of those communities, and it continues. And green recovery is therefore a critical part of this. How do we build back policy-wise, infrastructure-wise, various other measures in a way that can infuse climate resilience, nature-based solutions into the recovery process to get to some of the root causes of vulnerability of ecosystems and communities across Jamaica and across other SIDS in the Caribbean and beyond. And so it's a great pleasure to have with us today UNDP's Global Director of the Human Development Report Office, Pedro Canseco, who's with us online. Thank you for joining us, Pedro. We'll hear from him shortly about the 2026 Human Development Report that's under development and some of the issues in focus. I think Dean Ricketts focused it in on the main focus of the global report being on aspirational approaches to that human-nature relationship. And so that's really about embracing various shifts going forward, shifts in values. Are conventional development theory, policy, practice complicit in some of the crises that we're seeing, planetary, local? And how should that then change through a new ethics, a new set of values about that human-nature relationship? Shift in institutions. Are institutions really fit for purpose, future-ready institutions with that ability of foresight, futures thinking, complexity approaches to really factor in effectively this nexus between humans and planet futures? And a shift in metrics of development. As mentioned, the Human Development Report has a core focus on those metrics. Some years ago, it brought forward the innovation of the Planetary Adjusted Human Development Index as an initial step to bringing in some of the ecological footprint issues. And then this year, through this year's HDR, it will focus, as you mentioned, on the Nature Relationship Index and other innovations that our colleagues from the Human Development Report Office will soon elucidate. So it's really about, the opportunities for bringing that thought leadership. We have some of the biggest thought leaders in the room with us here today, and so I want to say a big thanks to all of you for being here together with us. And we're looking for really critical insights, ways we can really, bend that curve, and have a bright future for a new nature-human relationship embedded in development policy globally, but also here in Jamaica. And that will be critical as we, as UNDP, advance our cooperation with government on things like recovery framework and planning, a series of new investments in Western Jamaica on ecosystem restoration, on green recovery. And so this is also as practical application from putting theory into practice. Thank you again, and looking forward to a great discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cody. Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you for the reminder of what emerges when we have these levels of partnerships at work. We're going to move to an online presentation. Allow me to acknowledge Dr. Pedro Conseco, forgive me, sir, Director, Human Development Report Office, UNDP. He will give us an overview of the 2026 Human Development Report and the framing of the key issues for the roundtable this afternoon. Colleagues, could we just put our hands together as we move our attention to an online presentation?
Thank you so much, Tanisha. Can you hear me?
Yes, we're hearing you, and our tech will help us to hear you a little louder. Can you go again, Director?
Yes, can you hear me?
We're getting there, Director. Just a moment, please.
Sure.
Could you go again, Director?
Yes, Tanisha, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, beautiful, sir.
Okay, very good. Let me thank you, start by thanking you, Dean Rickett and Ambassador Weber, and also Kishan for his leadership. You may not know that Kishan is not only a very able and distinguished UNDP leader, but is also someone that has been championing some of the work around understanding planetary change and implications for human development over many years in different roles in UNDP. So thank you, Kishan, for all the work and the collaboration that you have done with our office over the years. So I'll present some slides, if that's okay. Let me try to share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yes, Director.
Very good. So this is work in progress. It's still preliminary, and as Kishan alluded, it's part of the set of conversations and consultations that we rely on to shape the Human Development Report. So consider this conversation as an input, and we look at all of you as contributors to the effort that we'll publish hopefully later this year. So let me articulate the argument in short. It's in three steps. Basically, the premise is that development thinking and practice, to a large extent, sort of bypass nature and focus more on accumulating produced capital and human development outcomes. Secondly, we see that pressures on nature or the biosphere are eroding nature's resilience, harming already human development. And in addition, this might become, going forward, a more and more important constraint in advancing human development. And so these 2 points together call for some refresh in human development approaches and metrics. So we are not starting from scratch. We've been looking into how dangerous planetary changes are likely to shape prospects for human development. We gave new impetus to this reflection with the 2020 Human Development Report, in which, as Kishan alluded to, introduced a new index that we called Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index. And the work that we are doing in the 2026 Human Development Report builds and expands some of the work that we've been focusing on in our office for some time and will continue to undertake going forward. So let me start by asking what might be a simple and straightforward question. What do we mean by nature? And I'll use the words nature and biosphere as interchangeably. And of course, we can think of nature as ecosystems like the rainforest that you see on screen. But nature is also composed of ecosystems that may live in things as small as 1 gram of soil, which may contain as many as 10 billion bacterial cells. And of course, we ourselves and what we do is also part of the biosphere. So we can think of nature or the biosphere as a web of interconnected, regenerating ecosystems. And I think the word here, regenerative, is key, because we may do a lot of things to nature, and nature has sort of an ability to, for the most part, bounce back. Except that we are now reaching a stage in which this may be facing some constraints. And we can think of nature as sort of an invisible engine of human development, because it gives us many things, the things that you see listed here on the left of this slide: food, timber, medicine, dyes, fibers, fresh water, and also more cultural services by looking at landscapes that we consider beautiful or even sacred. And for the most part, we have been doing a very good job at extracting what ecologists call provisioning goods, so what you see on the left hand of this scale. And these are things in which markets often work well, and if markets don't work well, we have non-market institutions like protected areas or natural parks that enable us to protect those parts of nature to which we attribute meaning and importance. But along with this kind of goods and services, nature provides other kinds of what ecologists call regulating and supporting services. So these are the things that are listed on the right, that regenerate the soil, recycle nutrients, control floods, mitigate droughts, filter pollutants. So many things that nature does, including maintaining the composition of the gases in the atmosphere. And so I'm using this framing to put some of the challenges that we often focus on as separate from what we're doing to nature as part of this broader set of challenges that result from the fact that we are perhaps extracting too much from nature, that is eroding this ability of nature to provide these regulating and supporting services. So one example is indeed climate change, right? Climate change results, in a sense, from this inability of the biosphere to maintain a stable composition of gases in the atmosphere. Another example could be the depletion of the ozone layer. These are obviously very important, and this is what inspired innovations like the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index, which includes indicators like CO2 emissions as part of the set of pressures that we're putting on the planet. And these are, in a sense, conceptually at least, I mean, not in practice, but conceptually relatively simple problems, because we can clearly articulate what the goal is, climate stability. We understand what the problem is, climate change. We have metrics to measure it by looking at how temperature is changing. We know the cause. It's related primarily to the rise in greenhouse gases emissions. We know what's driving this increase in greenhouse gas emissions, particularly use of fossil fuel to produce energy and land use changes. We also know who is responsible. We know who is undertaking these activities, and we can assign responsibility to individuals, to firms, to countries. That's why we are able to construct this planetary pressures index that I alluded to. And we also know what to do. We have the technologies, the solutions when it comes to renewable energy as well, and we also know what we need to do sort of on the institutional side, on the policy side. Now, I'm saying this is simple conceptually. I'm not saying it's obviously simple to implement in practice, but it's the kind of problems that are attractive to policymakers. Now, if we take a broader view at other regulating and supporting services, many of them do not follow this simple structure. And a key distinction is that the benefits of some of these regulating and supporting services are much harder because it's difficult to appropriate the benefits by specific individuals, firms, of countries. So markets tend to not work very well, and even on-market institutions are hard to conceptualize, to design, because the biosphere is this tangled web of ecosystems at multiple scales, undergoing processes that are mobile, silent, and invisible. And typically we cannot assign the same kind of responsibility that we are able to do when it comes to drivers of climate change. So recently there was a review by Partha Dasgupta on the economics of biodiversity, and he concluded basically by saying that the only solution is to cultivate what he called an affection for nature, because as you can see on the quote here on the left at the bottom, just who is responsible for a particular harm is often neither observable nor verifiable. And he argues that no social mechanism can meet this problem in its entirety, meaning that no institution can be devised to enforce social responsible conduct. So in this context, what has been the typical response to deal with these challenges? It has been essentially framing the challenges that we confront around avoiding tipping points or staying within boundaries or limits. And this is obviously grounded in science, because many of the processes that govern ecosystems are non-linear. And so when you cross some of these thresholds, this worsens the ability of nature, of the biosphere, to provide these goods and services, particularly those related to these regulating services. Now, an argument of our report is that this dominant approach is important, but is perhaps hitting decreasing returns and may need to be supplemented with something else. There are several reasons as to why this may be important, but I will emphasize this idea that it's less about convincing individuals that nature is important and needs to be preserved. For the most part, people report being convinced of this, and more the fact that fear-based narratives, approaches that seek to scare people into acting, may not be as motivating to lead people to act together, collectively, to address these challenges. And so we are, on one hand, suggesting that it's important to mobilize aspirations. That's why we are calling our report for a more aspirational approach to how confront these challenges, to supplement these fear-based narratives that seek to motivate people to act to address planetary challenges. And related to this, it's important also to see human progress as something that has been, in a sense, an enemy of nature, but going forward does not have to be. That it's possible to conceive of actions and pathways in which nature and people can thrive together. I will not go into detail on each of these points. I will just briefly try to articulate a little bit more clearly what do I mean by this last point, that human progress can be something that goes along with protecting nature. So this slide comes from a paper that was published just last week, actually, in Science, and looks at these two potential goals of management of the biosphere, interaction of the biosphere. So on the one hand, we want the biosphere to provide environmental benefits, which are represented here on the vertical axis on this scale, and also economic benefits represented here on the horizontal axis of this scale. So if we focus on landscapes, we can look at landscapes in which we extract from them a maximum environment benefit. So it would be something that would be up here, so something that is totally green with no basically economic benefits extracted. So on the graph, it would be this point here. Or something that provides maximum economic benefit and very little environmental benefits. So this would mean that would be on this point here. And you can sort of trace a curve that would represent a line in which you seek to find a balance between providing some economic benefits and some environmental benefits. Now, if you are on the maximum possible way of combining, extracting both environment and economic benefits, you would be on what economists call a Pareto efficiency frontier, which is this line here. Now, if we are on this line, there is a trade-off, right? So as you seek to increase the economic returns or benefits, you are bound to reduce the environmental benefits. That's what it's the meaning of this downward sloping line. And some countries like Japan, for instance, are very close to the line. So for a country like Japan, we are very close to a place in which there are trade-offs, right? So if we want to extract more environmental benefits from the landscapes in Japan, we will have to sort of pay an economic price. But the point of this paper is that for most of the world, the landscapes are inside this frontier. So we are sort of where this orange dot here. So what this means in practice is that we can actually move along pathways in which we both extract economic returns and more environmental benefits. So in a sense, there's sort of a free lunch and there is no trade-off. So this is to articulate this idea that for most of the world, we are in a space in which we can advance these goals together. The goals of advancing human well-being, advancing prosperity, and advancing environmental benefits and extracting environmental benefits. So with this background, I'll move to some of the things that we're planning on doing on the Human Development Report. I will not cover everything, but I will focus on two key innovations that we are seeking to introduce. The first is related to this, to what to do if we accept that we need both an affection for nature the conclusion of the Dasgupta review, and to mobilize human aspiration. So how do we operationalize this? And our proposal is to introduce, as Kishan has already alluded to, something that we are tentatively calling a nature relationships index. So the idea is to expand the aspirational space of human development to measure concrete outcomes that benefit both people and the biosphere. So if it is possible to have an index that would enable us to figure out if we are on that pathway on the slide that I showed earlier, in which we increase both benefits for people, for humans, as well as preserving and actually enhancing the biosphere. So this is one thing that we want to do. But the other thing is that aspirations for the future need also to be confronted with the reality of the present, of today. And so we are trying to make the case that prospects for human development today are already being shaped and constrained by planetary change. And this is something that is no surprise for people living in the Caribbean, as we've heard. And to do that, we aim at creating a new index in which we try to bring together a number of environmental hazards. And part of the idea with this that we are tentatively going to call the multi-environmental hazard index is to show that there is an overlap between environmental hazards and human vulnerability. So I'll speak briefly to these two indices without going into a lot of detail, but just to give you a sense of what we are aiming to achieve. So on the Nature Relationship Index, some of the key ideas have been put out there already in some publications. About a year ago, we put out a paper in Nature in which we presented the conceptual framework. The paper is called An Aspirational Approach to Planetary Futures. And this quick response code that you see on the screen, you can go to the paper and take a look if you're interested. I also put out an op-ed in the Financial Times a little later in August last year that seeks to articulate what we mean by this aspirational approach. And in addition to conceptualizing what we mean by a nature relationship, by nature relationships and by aspirations, we seek to create a quantitative measure in the form of an index. So this is very much inspired by the Human Development Index that Dean Ricketts alluded to a moment ago. And just to remind you that Human Development Index has 3 dimensions: standards of living, achievements in health, achievements in education. And we want to replicate this simple structure in this Nature Relationship Index, and we consider 3 dimensions as nature is thriving and accessible, because this is not only about how nature is faring, but whether nature is also producing outcomes important for humans. Nature is used with care and respect, and nature is safeguarded. So the trick here, as with the Human Development Index, is to come up with indicators, with proxy metrics that would enable us to quantify these 3 dimensions. So this has been the work that we've been undertaking over the last year or so. We are close, and I can show you what hopefully the NRI, Nature Relationship Index, will look like. So these are some of the indicators that we are considering. So for the first dimension, nature is thriving and accessible, things like thriving landscapes. Nature is safeguarded, things like clean air and water. So the idea here is to have both dimensions as well as indicators that are widely understood by the public at large and by policymakers and decision makers. And on the basis of these indicators, we can then compute an index that goes from 0 to 1 that would look something like what you see on this map. So don't hold me to the results. This is still experimental work that we are testing. And the idea is to then place this nature relationship index on sort of the vertical axis here, and the human development index on the horizontal axis here, and see how countries fare on these two dimensions. And obviously this is meant to represent not only where countries are, but also to give guidance on how to move to this aspirational space represented here by an image of our planet, of having high levels of the Human Development Index and high levels of this Nature Relationship Index. So again, this is a way, in a sense, to heed the call of having something that stimulates this notion of having an affection for nature, right? So if nature is this complex, entangled web of ecosystems at multiple scales in which we cannot really attribute responsibility to the actions of an individual, of a country, to damages that may have many cascading effects across many scales. We believe that having an instrument such as the Nature Relationship Index is a possible response to have a sense of the extent to which societies are having a reciprocal relationship with nature. Now let me move to the other index. So the notion here is understanding how dangerous planetary change is actually something very unfair and already driving or curbing prospects for human development. So what you see on this slide is work that we published in October of last year. We publish every year a report on multidimensional poverty, and that report seeks to explore the overlap between high levels of multidimensional poverty and exposure to some hazards, including high temperature. So what we saw was that many parts of the world, not everywhere, but many parts of the world where there was a high incidence of multidimensional poverty were also very exposed to extreme heat. So parts of South America, parts of the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, some parts of South Asia. And so the idea here is to expand on this and to provide information that is useful for policymakers. A recent report from UNEP asked policymakers what they consider to be the most important constraint in enable them to act on climate adaptation. And often we think that finance is a big constraint. And yes, finance came up as important, but only number 3. More important than financial constraints were institutional bottlenecks and informational gaps. So our idea is to construct an index that seeks to redress some of these informational gaps. And again, this builds on some of the work that we have done in the past. We have something that we call Human Climate Horizons platform, which is available. If you Google, you can go to a website that looks like this. You can choose a country, and it looks at 2 hazards presently, temperature change increase and sea level rise, and seeks to establish links to human development outcomes, so implications for mortality, labor supply, energy demand, and crop productivity. But the shortcoming of this work up to now is that considers only 2 hazards. So what we want to do going forward is to add more environmental hazards. Obviously, we can go big, and eventually we want to go big and construct a planetary hazards index that include many things. So things related to health systems, food systems, water, ecosystems, but for now we are focused on an index that includes 6 hazards: heat stress, drought, sea level rise, extreme storms, flooding, and extreme precipitation. So this is what the index would look like. First, this is a representation of the individual hazards at the country level: drought, flood, heat, extreme precipitation, tropical cyclone, sea level rise. And we then want to calculate this not only at the country level, but at a more granular level. So we can estimate exposure to these hazards at grids of about 25 kilometers. And the idea then is to bring all of this together in a single index. So this is what it would look like. So again, an index from 0 to 1, 0 less exposure to the index, 1 more exposure to the hazard, sorry. And this would be what the index would look like. And as with the NRI, the Nature Relationship Index, the idea is not to stay just with the hazards, but then to link this to human development and to the Human Development Index. And we can do that at this level of resolution now, because some of the work that we've been doing in our office has been to estimate the level of the Human Development Index, not only at the level of countries, which is what we report in our Human Development report every year, but also to use machine learning and satellite images to estimate it at a very, very granular level. So the Human Development Index at this level of granularity and our multi-hazard environmental index, we can then look at the distribution of different parts of the world to both the hazards, which is represented here in the horizontal axis, and Human Development Index here on the vertical axis at different scales. So countries, we have dots, and we move towards more granular representation. So if we are at the level of this 25 kilometers grid, we have a lot of data points, as you can see here on this chart at the bottom. And the message here is that you see sort of a downward sloping line when you try to see if there's a correlation between the two, meaning that countries or regions that are more exposed to hazards are also those that tend to have lower levels of the Human Development Index. So let me stop here. The message with our report is to argue that human aspirations are not the problem necessarily, and can actually be part of the solution if we see people as using here a quote by Amartya Sen, as reflective creatures, beings who are able to reason about and decide what they would like to happen, rather than just being compellingly led by their own needs. So let me pause here, and thank you again for your attention, and looking forward to the conversation, comments, and inputs during this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Director. And thanks for that reminder of the interconnectedness between nature and development, the trade-offs we have been making. Thanks for introducing us to some of the indices we're using to characterize some of those concrete outcomes between people and the biosphere, and other indices we're using. I imagine one of the reflections for us as we meet is what are maybe some key dimensions that may be missing for our context, as we now narrow focus to the Caribbean and Jamaica, and we shift our discussions a little in that light. What are other issues and contexts that we must be considerate of as we navigate and as we explore these indices? So thank you so much, Director. Colleagues, we move then to our keynote. we're going to be discussing the theme Climate and Human Futures in Jamaica and Caribbean SIDS. Our speaker is Professor Michael Taylor, Professor of Climate Science and Dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology. I want to say the best faculty, but maybe being in social sciences is not a good time to say something like that. Colleagues, put your hands together as Prof. Taylor comes forward.
Okay, I'm just waiting for the share the screen. And I'm not going to make any things about which is the best faculty or which is not the best faculty. But colleagues, it is good to be here. Perspectives on climate and human futures in SIDS after Melissa. 3 sides of the coin. So let me begin by saying good afternoon, and let me also begin by doing 2 things. Firstly, let me thank those who extended the invitation for me to deliver this framing keynote. I am truly honored to have been asked and humbled that you considered me worthy of this assignment. Thank you. The second thing I wish to do, however, is apologize. I apologize that I am a Caribbean climate scientist. Now, let me explain why that matters. Firstly, it matters because it means that once again, in what is becoming a recurring theme in my recent speaking engagements, I feel like an imposter. I look around the room, I see social scientists, thought leaders everywhere, development thinkers, economists, and policy experts. My imposter syndrome as a scientist speaking in this space is currently operating at record levels. Secondly, but not unrelated, I apologize because it inevitably means I'm going to ground my remarks in science. No equations, I promise, but certainly climate science. However, climate science from the small island developing states, or SIDS point of view, that is from the point of view of societies whose economies, livelihoods, cultures, and daily lives remain deeply sensitive to climate. But the third reason I apologize, and is perhaps the most important, because when you begin to speak about climate science through a SIDS lens, it almost inevitably takes on a crisis framing. Perhaps then you see the problem. The concept note for this afternoon's dialogue suggests it is to feed into a reframing of the nature-human development relationship. It suggests that whereas crisis narratives have been effective in sounding the alarm, they have not always inspired the sweeping transformation needed to create better futures. This dialogue is to explore whether we might move towards alternative framings, as I understand it, for the people-planet nexus. So then, what am I, a SIDS climate scientist, essentially studying crisis science, doing here, delivering this keynote to start this dialogue? I see a problem, a red flag, a big warning light. It is either that I'm in deep trouble and woefully out of place this afternoon, or those who invited me, I'm not calling any names, are the ones in deep trouble and are only now realizing that they may have asked the very wrong keynote speaker. I am hoping that, in fact, the truth lies somewhere in between, and so I'm going to ask you to indulge me. You see, all I want to do this afternoon is suggest that whatever framing eventually emerges, it must still be capable of representing our lived reality. And for SIDS, particularly Jamaica in the wake of Hurricane Melissa, that reality is climate experienced as crisis. Not climate as theory, not climate as abstraction, not climate as future possibility, but climate in our lived and present reality is crisis. So let me be true to myself and offer perspective on this crisis, drawing lessons from Melissa. But let me do it in a real simple way. Please forgive me for the simplicity of it. Allow me to explore with you this afternoon what we see when climate change, as it manifests itself in SIDS, is viewed through the lens of human development. So I want to suggest that 3 perspectives relevant to human futures in SIDS emerge when we do this, and that Melissa can be used to illustrate each of them clearly. Today, I am proposing those 3 perspectives also represent 3 sides of a coin. So put that all together, and the title of the presentation suddenly makes sense. Perspectives on climate and human futures in SIDS after Melissa, 3 sides of the coin. My hope is that by exploring the 3 sides, I can provide at least some small measure of useful context for the framing deliberations that will follow. So here goes. Perspectives on climate and human futures in SIDS after Melissa, 3 sides of the coin. Let's take the first perspective and the first side of the coin. Perspective number 1 is this. When the climate crisis is viewed through the human development lens, what we see is climate as an overwhelming threat to human futures in SIDS. But let me explain. In SIDS, climate manifests itself in ways we are becoming all too used to now. As rising temperatures, more consecutive really hot days and nights in a given year, as increasingly erratic rainfall patterns with prolonged dry periods interrupted by intense downpours, as rising seas and accelerated coastline decline, as extreme drought, extreme flooding, and of course, extreme hurricanes. And in this new climate era, it is not one manifestation or another, but a multi-hazard scenario where 2 or more contend at the same time. It is not hard to see then that for SIDS, climate change is already an environmental crisis. So I look at the Planning Institute of Jamaica's listing of climate hazards from 1999 to present reveals a defining characteristic of this crisis. And that characteristic is unpredictability. There's an unpredictability in which a combination of hazards will occur in a given year, whether it's hurricane and hurricane, hurricane and drought, or hurricane and heat. There's unpredictability in the intensity of the hazard, whether 2024, when we had the warmest year on record in the Caribbean, or 2025, when we had extreme Hurricane Melissa. There's unpredictability in their timing, and there's unpredictability in their frequency of reoccurrence. The climate reality of SIDS is therefore not simply one of hazards, it's one of multi-hazard unpredictability. But the science goes further. It also suggests that this reality is unlikely to disappear. It also suggests that this reality is unlikely to disappear. Under current trajectories of global climate action, future changes are expected to entrench rather than remove the unpredictability, but at unprecedented levels. Further warming, more erratic rainfall, but veering around a much drier baseline, significantly higher sea levels, more time spent in droughts, and the passage of more intense hurricanes. For SIDS, from the science, climate change represents a present environmental crisis which will continue into the future at even greater levels. So, what happens? Struggling with my point, my clicker. So, what happens then? I'm going to change. So what happens then when that crisis interacts with human development? Melissa has shown us the climate crisis does not stop at the environment. When it interacts with human development, it spills over into human development. By this I mean the unpredictable and unprecedented nature of climate change begin to overwhelm some of the very conditions upon which human development depends. Melissa revealed this with unusual clarity, and let me suggest how. By firstly showing up the loss of reliability of human development systems. Truth is, human development depends on systems performing consistently. Health systems, education systems, housing systems, transportation systems, water and energy systems, livelihood systems. In each case, their effectiveness is built upon assumptions like schools will open, hospitals will function, homes will remain standing, crops can be harvested, roads will remain passable, electricity and water will be available, and in so doing, each of these systems will deliver human development. Climate is simply making a mockery of these assumptions. Melissa exposed the uncomfortable truth that many of the assumptions upon which these systems were built no longer hold in this climate era. Immediately after the hurricane, 616 schools could not open. 105 health facilities could not function. Several communities were cut off. 631 of 763 water systems did fail, and 77% of the electricity network did collapse. Many farmers did lose crops and income, and businesses did cease to operate. In many instances, those disruptions continue to today. The issue is not simply that individual assets were damaged, it is that the systems upon which human development depends became unreliable. And that is the challenge. Human development requires reliability, but climate change introduces unpredictability. And the more unpredictable the climate becomes, the less reliable the system becomes. But secondly, Melissa also showed up the loss of continuity. Again, let me explain. Climate shocks do not only threaten individual sectors, they threaten the continuity of development itself. Human development assumes forward motion. So children must progress through school. People must move into better jobs. Families must accumulate assets. Countries must expand infrastructure and services. And communities must build wealth. In other words, each generation is expected to advance further than the one before. Unpredictability at unprecedented levels, otherwise known as climate shocks, interrupt that progression. And the issue now is not simply about damage, it is about the repeated interruptions, because recovery takes years. But the next shock is arriving before recovery is complete. That's the PIOJ table I showed you before, but refashioned to show the limited recovery time between events. So what happens? Resources intended for human development are redirected towards reconstruction, and social infrastructure plans and social investments are postponed or deferred in favor of infrastructure plans. And so development aspirations are delayed. Melissa revealed this dramatically. But the pattern is also seen across decades of climate shocks affecting Jamaica and other states. So development gradually becomes less about moving forward and more about recovering what was lost. And that is a profound threat to human futures in states. But one more. Melissa also showed up our loss of humanity itself. Because ultimately, human development is about people. Melissa reminded us that climate impacts are not experienced equally. Some lose more, some recover slower, some are displaced, some lose treasured possessions accumulated over a lifetime, some lose their homes, some lose their communities, some lose places that help define who they are, and some lose hope. And with these losses, for those most impacted, come loss of dignity, loss of a sense of belonging, loss of identity, loss of a sense of fairness, and loss of social cohesion. Human development is not only about what people have, it's also about who people are and who they believe they can become. And climate change is threatening that too. So when viewed through a human development, we see that the climate crisis moves beyond merely an environmental threat to a threat to the reliability of the development systems upon which people depend. We see that it's a threat to the continuity of the pathways through which human development occurs, and a threat to the humanity that development ultimately seeks to serve. Taken together, these make a compelling case that climate change represents not just a threat, but an overwhelming threat to human futures in SIDS. And I would suggest that any future framing of the environment-human development relationship must be capable of capturing that reality if it is to be true for SIDS. What about coin side number 2? Well, perspective number 2 is this. When the climate crisis is viewed through the human development lens, we also see an opportunity for transformation of human futures in SIDS. But I have to be be careful about this. So let me quickly declare that I'm not suggesting that climate change is good, nor am I suggesting that Hurricane Melissa was somehow beneficial. The losses are too profound, the suffering is too real, and the disruption is too widespread for such a claim. But I am suggesting that climate crises may be creating some openings that, if capitalized on, may help advance societal well-being in SIDS. And let me explain again using Melissa. You see, for many years, many of us in the climate science community, and I know Prof. Stevens will agree with me, have worked to build both awareness of and action in response to climate change in SIDS. Speaking from personal experience, we have done everything from published papers through media appearances to a plethora of workshops and dialogues to developing educational material. And while all of that has been important and no doubt impactful, Melissa did what we couldn't in a matter of days. Firstly, Melissa produced a widespread awareness of the climate people link. That the awareness is widespread is not to be disputed. In the post-Melissa era, Melissa conversations are everywhere, from home to street corners, from business to parliament, and from traditional and on both traditional and social media. And they involve just about everybody, not just academics anymore, but students and professionals, young and old, lower, middle, and upper income earners, the entire makeup of Jamaican society. Equally important, however, is that the conversation has also shifted. The question is no longer simply whether climate change is real. The question now is, what is climate change doing to our lives? That is a fundamentally different conversation. As though it is still about climate change, it is now about climate change in human development terms. The opportunity then is to capitalize on an environment in which the climate people link is now widely known through personal experience. It is an opportunity to institutionalize the idea through education, to formally embed it in public discourse, to strengthen leadership and policy around it, and to use it as a basis for driving collaboration and collective action. The shifting from climate change as an environmental discussion among only a few into a wider societal human development discussion may prove one of the most important opportunities for human futures in SIDS emerging from the crisis. But a second opening, however, to be capitalized on, as brought on by Melissa, is a shared acceptance that climate action must be purposeful. Melissa wanted us beyond merely accepting that climate action is necessary, as the science has long been saying that, to a societal convergence around the idea that the purpose of climate action matters as well. For many years, action has been framed around protecting assets and infrastructure and reducing losses. Whereas those remain important objectives, Melissa exposed the limitations of that framing by reminding that roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, and utilities matter not because of what they are, but because of what they enable people to do or become. Said another way, Melissa made it clear that infrastructure is not the end goal of development, people are. This represents a fundamental shift to the objective of climate action, as often spoken about today, around which the society seems to be coalescing post-crisis. This represents an opportunity then to design a new framework for all resilience-focused development options being considered. The opportunities to reframe the objectives of adaptation, mitigation, climate finance, technology, innovation, and even climate research in a post-Melissa world. Those now become not merely environmental interventions, but investments in human future. For example, adaptation must now equally protect infrastructure and dignity, restore connectivity as well as opportunity, deliver efficiency and equity, and improve resilience as well as the conditions that allow people to flourish. In other words, the crisis has created an opportunity to redefine not merely what actions we take, but what those actions are ultimately trying to do. And finally, a third opening, as revealed by Melissa, which can be capitalized on, is a growing demand for new approaches to development. Again, let me explain. Melissa demonstrated something that many SIDS are beginning to recognize. Climate change is moving faster than many of our traditional development models. Historically, our approach has often looked something like this: development, then disaster, then recovery, then development resumes. Melissa, however, reminded us that this model is becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. In fact, right now, we are contending with the reality of the lingering impact of Melissa, plus the impending impacts of a looming El Nino. Have you heard about it? And so a new approach is demanded. And I'm arguing it looks something like this: development, then disaster, then recovery plus preparedness plus adaptation plus development. The latter all occurring simultaneously. In other words, the luxury of sequencing no longer exists. We must recover while preparing, rebuild while adapting, and restore while transforming. The growing demand for new approaches offers the opportunity for things once viewed as radical to be entertained: adaptive planning, anticipatory action, and continuous resilience building. So we're learning that we need social protection systems that can respond before, during, and after shocks, and development models capable of operating in a world characterized by repeated interruption. The opportunity of the crisis lies in its giving us permission to rethink assumptions that perhaps should have been challenged long ago. So, while the first side of the coin reminds us that climate change represents an overwhelming threat to humans' futures, the second side reminds us that the crisis is creating social conditions that perhaps didn't exist prior, which can be exploited for transformation. Widespread awareness of the link between climate and human development, shared acceptance that actions must be purposeful and judged not simply by what they reveal, and an emerging demand for new approaches which parallel human development with infrastructure recovery. Together, all three create a rare opportunity to rethink, redesign, and perhaps even reimagine development itself around people and their futures. And I would suggest that any future framing of the relationship between people and development and the planet should seek to capture that possibility if it is to be true to SIDS. Finally, side 3. One last perspective. Perspective number 3 is this: when the climate crisis is viewed through the human development lens, we see that SIDS currently find themselves on the edge and teetering. As I hope I have shown, there is ample evidence that climate change threatens human development in SIDS, and that there is also enough evidence that climate crisis is creating opportunities to rethink what development pathways look like. Melissa clearly showed us both. The reality, however, is that when it comes to human development, we have not yet permanently fallen on either side, as the threat has not yet completely overwhelmed it, nor has transformation advanced to the point where it is insulated from climate shocks. Instead, SIDS find themselves somewhere in between, on the edge. However, not comfortably balanced on the edge, but rather teetering. For balance would suggest stability, balance would suggest confidence, and balance would suggest equal likelihood of falling in either direction. That is not where SIDS are today. We are precariously positioned, and if I'm honest, perhaps leaning toward the side of threat, as the challenges to reliability, continuity, and humanity that I spoke of earlier continue to accumulate. Perhaps then the greatest challenge before us is neither recognizing climate's threats nor recognizing its opportunities, but determining how to tip the coin. How do we deliberately move toward transformation before circumstances push us further towards crisis? I don't have the answer to the question. I suspect that is precisely the purpose of the dialogue that is going to follow, and precisely what any new framing must help us address if that framing is to be relevant for SIDS. But allow me to offer 3 alternative questions for consideration. First, could deliberately investing in people help reverse the tilt? In the end, human development begins and ends with people. Their education, skills, leadership, climate literacy, innovation, science. Perhaps the most important adaptation investment available to any SIDS remains investment in its people. Infrastructure can be rebuilt and assets can be replaced, but resilient societies will ultimately depend upon capable people. 2, could continually interrogating our priorities help lean us in the right direction? For too long, our development discussions in the face of climate's challenge have understandably defaulted to economic indicators, infrastructure targets, and growth metrics. Those are important, but they do not yet adequately capture the loss of learning, the loss of biodiversity, the loss of culture, the loss of mobility, the loss of place, or the loss of opportunity. Should our priority be GDP-centered development, infrastructure-centered development, human-centered development, or combinations of each? Should we equally value measures of progress that tell us whether dignity is restored, opportunities expanded, vulnerabilities reduced, and human futures are strengthened? And 3, could making implementation regular practice become the mechanism that finally tips the coin? Melissa reminded us that we don't suffer from a shortage of plans, policies, and reports. Increasingly, as just noted, our greatest climate gap is no longer awareness, it is implementation. We know enough, at least to begin closing some of the gap between inaction and action. We know enough to move beyond the climate ambition with human development included. What I am saying is this: when we view the climate crisis through a human development lens, we see clearly where SIDS stand today. We are teetering on the edge. And perhaps this is the most important of the 3 perspectives. For to recognize where we stand is to recognize what is required. The future societal well-being of SIDS may well depend on whether we invest in people, whether we continually interrogate our development priorities, and whether, having done so, we begin to close the gap between awareness and action by making implementation our default practice. So I'm at the end, and I've gone on way too long. I started with a simple premise. It is impossible for me as a SIDS climate scientist to completely shake the climate crisis framing, because that remains our lived reality in SIDS. So what if we don't? What if instead we view it through the human development lens? What perspectives then emerge about human futures in SIDS? I'm suggesting that we clearly see these 3 things. We see clearly that climate crisis is an overwhelming threat to human futures in SIDS. We see clearly that notwithstanding that threat, the climate crisis may also be creating a rare societally aligned opportunity to rethink and redesign development pathways with people at the center. And thirdly, we see clearly that we are currently on the edge and teetering, and that the questions we ask and the choices we make today will be critical to determining the future direction of human development in SIDS. But the truth is that a coin cannot teeter forever. At some point, it will fall. So, if you forget everything I have said over the last however many minutes, I'm sorry, Prof. Stevens, perhaps just remember this. The coin represents our present lived reality, the moment as it we now find ourselves in, as climate is intersecting with human development. If you accept that, then the first side of the coin is really asking you to see the moment we are in. The second side of the coin is asking us to seize the moment we are in. And the third side is asking us to set the momentum for where we want to be. Whatever framing eventually emerges from this dialogue, I would suggest it must be capable of allowing us in SIDS to do all three. The human future of SIDS will ultimately depend on not only our ability to see both the threat and the opportunity, but on our willingness to act in appropriate ways while both remain visible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Taylor. Thought leadership. And we come back to our aims for the session. Actionable strategies to move beyond defensive and retreating approaches towards mobilizing people's aspirations for a better future to ensure that people and planet thrive, deliberately investing in people, interrogating our priorities, making implementation regular practice. Colleagues, before we move to shifting toward dialogues, I wondered if there were any comments, any immediate questions. We heard the framing from Director, we heard the climate change context as well, and some of the opportunities present. I wondered if anyone online or in the room had any first thoughts around what we've already heard.
I think one of my first thoughts is that what Prof. Taylor just said about the climate crisis being an opportunity for transformation. I think when we talk about the climate crisis, we have seen it in, I would say, negative terms. But this introduces, I want to say, a positive, because it is an opportunity for transformation. And that's what I'm holding on to at the moment.
Thank you so much for that, Dean. Any other colleagues, please?
Thank you very much. As I listen, so we're in the business school, Bonner School of Business and Management, and I want to assure Prof. Taylor, his language and his presentation is not as foreign as you would think. Because as I listened to you, I reflected on some of the concepts and understandings that we have in business around, for instance, the dark side of resilience, which the last bit of your presentation refers to that indirectly, which is the extent to which we have become so used to disasters, to threats, that it becomes debilitating. And then how do we respond to that? I also reflected as I listened to you, we often talk about VUCA, and the fact that we're moving now towards talking about a BANI existence, which is about brittleness, anxiety, anxious, non-linearity, and the I just slipped me, but I'll come back to it. But incomprehensible. And those terms are what we're using now to describe the context in which businesses are operating. Policies are being made, strategies are being made. So very much aligned across the board, which again underscores the, we talk about grand challenges, which concerns the topics that we're discussing now. They don't relate to one sector, to one group. They're all encompassing. And so very much then the response requires similar cross-disciplinary, cross-sectoral engagement towards identifying those solutions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doc. Could you just pass to Dr. and then just check if anybody online?
Yeah, as usual, a brilliant presentation, and really everyone stepping up to interrogate this very deep problem, not just in Jamaica, but planetary crisis and the innovative steps by the UNDP through the Human Development Report and the leadership of Dr. Kishan Kode. Really want to congratulate. But the kind of recurring theme for me in the presentation was whether or not we're making some assumptions in the presentation about development itself as being the crucible through which we should think our futures. Because if you think about the dominant characteristics of contemporary development processes, it has always been about crisis and catastrophe and sacrifice. And if we continue to treat that as our paradigm for futurescapes, we may be actually doing ourselves a disservice. So I would put on the table the development paradigm and looking at the three edges, I'd add a fourth, because if you look at the visual, the coin is in a circle, which looks like an abyss, a black hole. So if you start thinking about the part of it, you mentioned the dark side and some of the hidden imponderables, the losses that we are building upon in the development project, the kind of epistemic violence that indigenous communities have suffered from in terms of being displaced and having another paradigm take precedent over how you look at nature, how you look at our relationships with the things that make us human. So I think we deeply need to step back from the development paradigm as it has a very checkered history.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you so much for that. Again, colleagues, we put our hands together for Prof. Taylor. Thank you for the thoughts shared. And we are navigating and looking at, all right, what are those actionable strategies we can come out of this dialogue with to move the needle forward? Colleagues, we're moving to our first dialogue. We're going to turn our attention to systems, lessons from Hurricane Melissa on ways planetary change is reshaping multidimensional determinants of poverty and inequality. We have two presenters in this first dialogue, colleagues. We have Prof. Judy Mathuri, Professor of Sustainable Business and Development, Mona School of Business and Management, the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. And she'll be followed by Dr. Kevin Williams, Senior Research Fellow, Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, SALISES, the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. I wonder if I could beg my colleagues to aim for 7 minutes, drop on 8, and we'll see if we can open up the floor for any quick comments. The colleagues, could we put our hands together as Prof. Judy Mathuri comes forward?
So thank you so much for this opportunity. I tell you, Prof. Taylor, it's a hard act to follow, but I'm comforted because, where is Kevin? Kevin is here. Let me tell you this for just 2 seconds. It's a pleasure to be sharing this session with Kevin. It's the first time I'm meeting him in the UWI context. However, I have known him since 2004. We did our PhD together at the University of Nottingham. And he was from the economics department. I am from business school. So you can imagine this topic is from different perspectives completely. I'm sure he adopts a macro approach. I adopt a micro and meso. And therefore, I have thrown my presentation out of the window now. And because of all the great presentations that have come before me, and what I'm going to do really is throw questions back, just reflect, because all has been said that I would have loved to say. And the starting point for me, and I echo what was said earlier on, is that what we realize is that traditionally, we always said poverty increases climate vulnerabilities. That is the traditional, assumptions, premise that we have always adopted. However, now increasingly, as Melissa has shown us, climate vulnerability actually creates more poverty. And now, you said imposter syndrome. Now, I have imposter syndrome times 10. I am neither from the seas. I just experienced my first hurricane in the world with Melissa. You see, so you can imagine where we are coming from. And I'm not an economist with all the macro, stuff that you had earlier on. But what my research has taught me, and I'm increasingly inquiring and trying to think about, is how do we address the issue of poverty? We know poverty is multidimensional, we know that. But when we place, climate vulnerability at the center of it and begin to interrogate, what poverty might look like, then the relationship becomes a little bit different, when we flip it. Because, as Melissa showed us, climate vulnerability actually increases community poverty and inequality. We go now to St. Elizabeth, we will still see, the reality of that. But it also reduces our adaptive capabilities as individuals, as communities, as governments, and therefore we are more vulnerable. When future shocks you had, we are, still recovering from the previous crisis. Hurricanes, and now we are being prepared for the next hurricanes. And what is happening, the intensity over time in terms of the shocks is increasing, and we are getting into deeper poverty, which is connected to even intergenerational poverty. So now we have students who are still not going to school. What happens to that future generation when we are still not addressing the things that we are, that is affecting us at this current moment? So you can see all these things, and I won't go into details because they've been covered, but these are the manifestation of what we are experiencing currently. Now, the aspirations are, we want to look at, and I like what you said about framing and how we make sense of, climate vulnerability and the connections to poverty. How we frame this agenda is critical, because if we do not understand and we do not critically analyze who is affected, how they are affected, what we had, the lived experiences, and what interventions are needed, then we shall be in the same position 10 years to come. And so for us, really is considering very different things. In those boxes there, we are asking, how might we change even the way we analyze the metrics that we use when we talk about poverty, when we talk about development? I always read these things, and it is about education, it's about housing, it's about infrastructure. But now if we are looking at, the affective nature of climate, what does that actually mean? How do we even begin to measure that? How do we begin to measure connection, social connection? How do we begin to measure belongingness? How do we, that love of nature, how do we even begin to measure that? And therefore, colleagues, this is just one thing we have to begin reflecting around how we measure, our variables around poverty, around improved well-being. How do we ensure that as we do this, we are also building adaptive capabilities? And for me, I'm very much concerned at the meso and the micro level, because my preoccupation is how does business address poverty alleviation, and how does it move towards development? So I'll keep to my 6 minutes, so I'll be rushing. Some of the work that I've done, 20 years, this is, using the community development lens, because I think focusing on poverty alone is not enough. We have to think about, not just human development, but community development, because it is within the communities that we live. It is within those communities that we mobilize resources. It is those communities that we build our assets. At the center there is sustainable community development and thinking through a systems approach that economic, political, social systems, cultural systems, all sorts of systems are interconnected. We cannot develop interventions in silos. And therein lies the challenge, because we adopt a trade-off mentality. How do we navigate all these challenges while balancing and not trading off? Because when I teach managers, I discourage them from trade-offs, because technically they go for profits because they've traded off environmental sustainability, because that is what makes sense. And my question is, no, you should not trade off, but look at how might we, address development and seeing profits as a means to an end and not an end in itself. And trust me, that in itself creates a lot of discussions, debates, and contradictions within the classroom. And these are the contradictions we will have to face, because our reality must address those kind of challenges. So now, for me, it is how do we, I've done something that I should not have done. Oh, it's back. Where? Okay. So now here is where now we replace the planetary challenge in the middle. So this is my 20 years back work. So now my current thinking is, if we are thinking about community development, sustainable community development, and we place planetary challenge or change in the middle, what does that actually mean? How do we theorize it? But importantly, what should we be doing different? The challenge around nature and human relationship and the way we address interventions is very top-bottom. So when it comes to bottom, in terms of participatory methodologies, we are very thin at that. And if we are thinking about affection, making people love the environment, then we must rethink how we approach, community development, how we mobilize, how we build agency, and how we create voice. And so I've been told my time is up. I will stop there, and I'll stop there with just one last call to action. There are so many interrelationships that we have to think of between people, planet, now future generations, people, nature, so many relationships. But the question is, how do we begin to think about reducing poverty in ways that we see the interconnectedness of this relationship without looking at just people, or people, nature? It's complex. There's no one answer, but all I have to say is that we must really address the governance gaps. We must empower communities, because if we do not do things at the community level, however much governments will develop policies, they will be imposed on us, and we shall not have the agency and the voice to own this change and to be change agents. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Okay, I wanted to say two things at the outset. When we talk about climate shocks, we tend to concentrate on these large events, for example, Melissa buried and so on. Okay, but there is something quietly and powerfully taking place in Jamaica that we are ignoring, and it is disrupting life, livelihood, and so on, and that is heat. In Jamaica, there is some recent evidence coming out with colleagues from economics department that heat is associated with murder and shooting, and we do not take note of that. The evidence is here. Okay. The second observation is that we tend to believe that climate change is inevitable. It is not. Climate change is like globalization. It is a political action. It is a political decision. You can slow down globalization, and in some cases, as we have seen with change leadership in the US, that you can reverse globalization. Okay, you can slow down climate change, and over time, I would argue that you can reverse it. Maybe not our lifetime, but it is possible. Globalization has been slowed down, and potentially, it is possible that we might see something else, not globalization. Okay, so I'm looking at today I'm going to identify some mechanisms through which Melissa can shape multidimensional poverty and inequality in Jamaica. Okay, so for some context, my context is, go back to the previous slide. My context is Jamaica, SID. Okay, and as Professor Taylor suggested before, there are some unique characteristics of SID. Okay, and in preparing for this presentation, I was sort of pessimistic because here we are as a small island developing state. Okay, we have to contend with the consequences of climate shocks, all these major events, yet we contribute little or nothing to these events. Okay, moreover, by nature, smaller and developing state like Jamaica, we have competing interests. Okay, we have poverty, we have high crime rate, we have infrastructure gaps, and so on. So when we have large events like Melissa and Beryl, we have to reallocate resources, okay, to rebuild. So one can begin to think about the gaps or what we have to sacrifice, given that we have a limited amount of resources. Okay, so that is the context in which we have to grapple with these large events. We have not contributed to them. Okay, we have little or no, our resilience is relatively weak because of our resources gap. Okay, so and this is some definition for multidimensional multidimensional poverty. It's not just about income, it's about health, it's about education, it's about access to services, social inclusion. Okay, because we have disabled community, we have the elderly. They are for the most part, okay, they are excluded from decisions, okay, when they are taken. Okay, so we have to reflect on these communities. Okay, now as we were moving out of our death trap, okay, Jamaica was on a path, in fact, Jamaica, for the IMF, Jamaica was a poster child for how you can reduce your debt. Okay, we're coming from almost 100 and close to 150% of our national income. Okay, to close to about 69, to close to about 65, 70%. Okay, bam, we have Beryl. On top of Beryl, we have Melissa. Okay, so you call that a double shock. Okay, so that is what Jamaica has to contend with. Okay, it's a small island developing state, something that we didn't contribute to, yet we have to deal with the consequences. All right. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So I'm going to look at some mechanisms. Okay. So when Melissa made landfall, okay, we saw houses and physical assets destroyed. Okay. Some of those houses, when those houses destroyed, we have people who were in shelter. Okay, those shelters were overcrowded. We have an outbreak of leptospirosis and so on. Okay, putting additional strain on our healthcare system, a system that was already under pressure. Okay, all right. We have, we have people who have accumulated their household assets. Okay, those assets within a split second, all those assets were destroyed. All right, we have no, those people, when you begin to think of, for some people, their houses were the most important asset for them, the most valuable piece of asset for them. Okay, when their house is damaged, you're talking about, they're basically out there with nothing, okay, to fall back on, no collateral, okay, to fall back on. Next slide, please. Okay, we have livelihood and employment were destroyed in the western end of the country. Okay, we have in our food basket, St. Elizabeth. Okay, we have the entire agricultural sector was destroyed for the most part. Okay, as a result, we have that did not only affect St. Elizabeth. We have food spike right across, both food shortages, okay, food insecurity, and an increase in prices that permeates right across the country as a result of destruction in the agricultural sector. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. 1 minute. We have health and education dislocation. Now, stepping back, you have many kids in Jamaica, many kids who got one single hot meal per day. The school was the source of that one single hot meal per day. Now, many of these, Melissa, many of these schools were either damaged or used for shelter. Okay, and those kids did not have a hot meal, one single hot meal per day. I mean, this is a joking matter. Now, those kids have to contend with consequences that they did not play a part in. Okay, those kids have to contend with going with a hot meal per day for something that they have absolutely no clue about. Okay, so next slide, and then just wrap up. All right, so we have now. So when you think about the damage and destruction of our schools, you're talking about kids who are going to potentially lose their future earnings. Okay, these kids are our future. Okay, many of these kids, these are poor kids. They did not have the device to participate in remote learning. And in my view, this will have intergenerational effects. Okay, long after you and I are gone. Okay, let's move to the last slide and just conclude. So I just conclude with this last point, that building resilience through climate adaptation, social protection, disaster-resistant infrastructure, and inclusive recovery policies is essential for reducing poverty and inequality. But I'm very much pessimistic, because small island developing states like Jamaica, we're not at the table when the decision is being made about climate change. And therefore, our voices are not reflected in those decisions. And I'll conclude here, now we can have a discussion.
Our colleagues, Prof. Mathuri, Sir Kevin Williams, Those are sobering perspectives for us as we navigate development and the implications of Melissa on us as a region. Or want to open the floor? Any immediate comments? Sir David, am I seeing your hand? I'm just wondering. All right, just checking, Sir David, just checking. Any comments, colleagues online in the room? Any thoughts around what we've heard?
The mic or should I shout? Thanks very much. Just to reiterate the points made about schools. One, about the heat and the heat in the classrooms, even when you don't have hurricanes. And the other, the point made that if you use schools as shelters, then you put the next generation to major problems. One of the projects which I remember doing when I was working at UNDP was a combination of us putting money into repairing schools, but also making sure that there was food available in the school feeding programs in schools that had been affected. The main reason for doing that was not just to feed the children, but also to make sure that if you did that, people could send their children to school. They'd send their children to school regardless of whether they were learning, but so they could get fed. But it also meant that the parents no longer had to take care of the children during the day, so they could go about their business and earn some money. And that sort of project actually worked quite reasonably well for several of the schools that had been damaged. And it just, to underscore the point you made, we are talking about major potential damage if we continue the practice of using schools as if they were free hurricane shelters.
Colleague behind us has a comment as well.
Thanks, Dan. To complement the point just made, that Dominica, I think, has an interesting model here because they're actually now looking more at building long-term infrastructure. So it's not the case then that you have to vacate immediately because you have no place to vacate to. And I think that's a model for us as we think about how do we then build resilience, how do we then consider development and what development looks like in a disaster-prone area. And moving from that, as we are inside looking out, I think as we talk about development now and we recognize that more and more countries in the EU and so on are experiencing disasters that we've long grown accustomed to. There's the opportunity then to see what lessons can the Caribbean and SIDS actually offer to the rest of the world in terms of how they contemplate development in a non-linear and a brittle world where they are now seeing more of the disasters that we faced in the past. And I think then if we really see the Caribbean as an ecosystem that we can use to test, to learn from, to extrapolate to other regions, that would be a fantastic perspective that we could offer to the rest of the world as well. Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much. I think these have been really interesting and thought-provoking interventions. I'm just a little bit disturbed that we end on such a negative note because I think the question of the opportunity for transformation is really where the conversation needs to go. I think that there is an attempt on the part of the government to start to think through some responses in terms of shelters and shelter preparedness for disasters in terms of infrastructure. Certainly not enough in terms of education. I think there's much too much thought about the physical issues and not enough about the societal impacts and how the societal solutions need to come about and how the long-term solutions need to come about. But I think there is at least a beginning of a dialogue. Now, I think that the dialogue needs very much to be deepened, needs to include academia and to include the private sector, because you have to mobilize not only resources, not just about resources, but it's about skill sets and it's about, as I said, education in the broader sense of vocational education included, and industrial development, because the problem in the West is that there is very little income generating opportunity. And this is where the long-term poverty is going to come from. So I really think that this group, or this constellation of people here, need to push the government in terms of their approach, and try to create a broader platform for ANARA, which has been very controversial, to look more at long-term solutions rather than some band-aids.
Thank you. Excellent comment, colleague. Thank you so much for those colleagues. We have one more comment online. I do appreciate the non-academic position taken by Dr. Williams and the reality that being at the decision table is critical. The biggest challenge to SIDS is not having contributed to the problem and yet not having a say in the solution. It is indeed a political problem at the heart of it. And I think that political framing is a valid one. We take the point made there. Colleagues, we're going to move us then to dialogue number 2. We're looking at aspirations, new policies and indicators that foster nature-based solutions and future-proof recovery and development to 2030 and beyond. And we need to have that discussion. To lead us through, we have Dr. Sandra Tennant, Senior Lecturer, Department of Economics, University of the West Indies, Mona Campus. She will be followed by Mrs. Nadine Brown, Director, Sustainable Development, Planning Institute of Jamaica. Remember the deal, colleagues, aiming for 7, dropping on 8, so we can take a question or 2. Put your hands together as Dr. Tennant comes forward. Testing.
All right, good afternoon, colleagues. Let me start by apologizing for not having a proper presentation. I think I expected a focus group kind of, so I didn't but I will offer a few brief points on our topic, which is aspirations, new policies and indicators that foster nature-based solutions and future-proof recovery and development. And I hope you'll gain something from what I have to say. All right, so now nature-based solutions use healthy ecosystems to tackle climate, environmental, and development challenges while delivering benefits for people and nature. Historically, the environment has been often viewed as cost to be minimized, but today nature must be understood and valued as a critical infrastructure asset. And the Caribbean experience has made this abundantly clear. So for example, Jamaica has spent more than a decade undertaking a difficult and widely commendable fiscal consolidation. Yet in a matter of days, the passage of Hurricane Melissa placed much of what we want, through a lot of sacrifice at risk. And this is not unique to Jamaica. It's not Jamaica only, but the Caribbean countries, most Caribbean countries, have struggled to achieve debt sustainability and sustain economic growth. And we know that a major contributing factor is the extreme vulnerability that we face in natural disasters, particularly hurricanes and intense flooding. So we can speak of Grenada after Hurricane Ivan in 2004, where the damage was so severe that the loss and damage was equivalent of 200% of their GDP. Then we have Dominica after Hurricane Dean, where the losses were approximately $61-62 million. And then, of course, Jamaica. In 2 years, consecutive years, we had Beryl and Melissa. And the original estimate for Melissa was $8.8 billion loss and damage. And I think it was about 40% of our GDP. Or 7, no. Yes. No, right. Original, right. Yes. Right. So it's critical. It's important that we integrate nature-based solutions into economic programming and policies. And so I have about 4 main points to discuss as it relates to nature-based solutions, the actions, the activities that governments can use to protect, sustainably manage, and restore ecosystems while simultaneously addressing our social and economic challenges. So the first point includes mainstreaming nature-based solutions into national development and fiscal frameworks. So to future-proof development, nature-based solutions must be embedded directly into planning, into public finance, and into public financial management. And this means, one, integrating our nature-based solutions into medium-term expenditure frameworks, into our public investment management systems, and into our disaster risk financing strategies. Two, leveraging nature-based solutions to create nature-positive economic opportunities, such as jobs in land management, ecosystem restoration, and sustainable agricultural practices. Very important. Three, requiring nature-based solution options in all feasibility studies and cost-benefit analyses, especially as we consider the major infrastructure investments to be undertaken by NARO. The country's environmental assets and nature-based alternatives must be systematically assessed, valued, and incorporated into any project that is designed and implemented through the NARO. And of course, this pillar ensures that nature-based solutions are not peripheral projects, but more so now are important components of our national development planning. The second point focuses on creating or enabling regulation and incentive. Supportive regulatory environment is necessary to make nature-based solutions possible, practical, and profitable, such as regulatory actions include strengthening our land use or coastal zone regulations to protect fragile and critical ecosystems, increasing or introducing incentive for private sector investments in nature-based solutions. So we hear about crowding in private capital, but private capital will have a problem if private capital is not able to, with certainty, assess the returns to their investment. And so we need to ensure that that the framework, the regulatory framework, is there to allow for that to happen. Also, through tax credits, blended finance mechanisms, public-private partnerships, and resilience bonds. So we need to explore some of these ways to better integrate not just government, but private sector, communities, all into this whole matter of climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and nature-based solutions. And to establish standards for nature-based solution design, maintenance, monitoring, and ensuring interventions are scientifically sound, durable, and measurable. And then, of course, this pillar then create an enabling condition for nature-based solutions that attract investment and deliver long-term resilience. The third point requires a strengthening of community and local government. Very important, capacity. We're not hearing about strengthening local government, but they are an integral part of climate recovery, yes? And adaptation. Yes, for the communities, right? Because they know what's happening on the ground. We cannot be centralized as it seems to be happening. Okay, but nature-based solutions will succeed when communities and local governments are empowered to steward and manage ecosystems. And to facilitate this, we need to support or have supporting co-management arrangements between communities, local government, central government, and environmental agencies. We need participatory dialogue between the three. Two, we need funding local stewardship and maintenance, recognizing that nature-based solutions require ongoing care to remain effective. And three, ensuring policies reflect equity and inclusion through participation. Having our discourse with communities before projects are entered into, particularly for vulnerable groups who often depend most directly on our natural resources. And finally, point number 4 addresses data availability. As mentioned before, we need to be able to, with certainty, estimate return to reinvestment for crowding enough private capital. Right, so future-proof recovery and development, we need indicators that we also need indicators that genuinely capture resilience, ecosystem health, and the socioeconomic benefits of nature-based solutions. But before expanding the list of indicators, we must confront a practical reality that data availability is a major constraint. So in recent SDG-related research work, we encountered severe challenges with the availability of reliable data, particularly for SDG 14, which is life below water, and SDG 15, which is life on land. So unfortunately, our statistical institutions face an overwhelming burden. Each SDG goal contains multiple targets. Each target has several indicators. Each indicator requires disaggregation between sex, age, location, and other variables. So for a small national statistical office, this represents an unmanageable expansion of workload. So rather than multiplying indicators, maybe we should begin to prioritize a focused set of measures that truly matter. Indicators that are feasible to collect, meaningful for policy, and aligned with our national priorities. And so I just made a few suggestions. One, having natural capital accounting, where we integrate ecosystems assets directly into national balance sheets, so that degradation registered as a loss of national wealth to begin that process. And this shifts nature from being just invisible to being now economically recognized. Two, measuring percentage of critical tourism assets protected by ecosystems. So the hotels can understand how things like coastal reefs, mangroves, how their assets, the value that is preserved through these buffers, then if we are able to quantify it, then maybe now we may have a discussion point with the tourist sector. Availability and accessibility of public beaches and coastal spaces and parks, green spaces. And here we'll see whether or not there is, ecosystems health, social equity, the public value of our natural assets, our people benefiting from, and whether nature is thriving, the extent to which that is happening, and whether people and communities are able to access these public beaches and parks. 1 minute. And then, okay, I just choose one more. Assessing the rate of ecosystem restoration versus degradation. Are we gaining or are we losing natural assets? To begin to not only just have them in terms of measures, but more quantifiable measures. So we see whether deforestation or reforestation is occurring, and what is the value, what is the protection in terms of land and damage and losses. We need to find ways to begin to quantify these things. All right, so I will just close. In closing, let us choose environmental protection and renewed relationships with nature, even as we seek to grow and develop, of course. Our aspirations must be to measure progress not only by what we build, but what we sustain, by strengthening our policies, modernizing our indicators to incorporate some of these issues, and ensuring that infrastructure is resilient as we recover and build with nature.
I will go back to the gift script as well. Thank you very much, Khalid. Over to you, Ms. Nadine.
Good afternoon, everyone. A frog in my throat. I would first like to say thank you to UWI and to the UNDP for inviting us to this dialogue. I like to think that I'm among friends. We have a long-standing relationship with the UNDP, as well as with Prof. Taylor and Climate Studies Group owner, and our colleague right here. We really, so I think that I'm among friends. So I just want to raise about 4 key points as it relates to to nature-based solutions and their role in the recovery and resilience process. So the first point is that when we degrade our ecosystems, we diminish the resilience of our communities and contribute significantly to disaster risk. Therefore, we have to integrate nature-based solutions and environmental recovery into the broader resilience, recovery, and reconstruction agenda. And I'll use Hurricane Melissa to bear out this point. Melissa caused extensive damage to our forest ecosystems and our coastal and marine ecosystems. There was widespread tree fall, loss of canopy, degradation of our mangrove forests and our coral reefs. The amount that the cost related to damage, loss, and additional costs for the environment was over 209 billion Jamaican dollars. 88% of that was assigned to the degradation or the loss of ecosystem services. Despite that, however, what the research also found, or what the assessment also found, that's a damage and loss assessment for Hurricane Melissa. What it found was that evidence suggests that in locations where mangrove forests and or coral reef systems were intact, these ecosystems help to attenuate wave energy, reduce coastal flooding, and limit shoreline erosion, therefore mitigating damage to adjacent communities and infrastructure. And we saw this, yes, for our ecosystems or nature-based solutions, but we also saw it for infrastructure, where our smart hospitals where we shored up our health centers. And under the smart hospital programs, those were the health centers that survived Hurricane Melissa. The second point is recommendations coming out of the Hurricane Melissa dialogue for the environment sector are actually consistent with the nature relationship aspirational approach, because it advocates for building forward better with nature. So that shifts from the destructive development to a more climate-friendly development. Some of the recommendations coming out of the report to build long-term resilience in the environment sector include NBS-based coastal protection investments, including mangrove restoration, coastal rehabilitation, long-term watershed and forest management interventions, protecting our water resources, soil conservation, reforestation, etc. Another point I would like to make is, as it relates to new policies, I think Jamaica has already begun to shift away from the reactive defensive model of climate response. We have begun, we're moving slowly, we're not moving fast enough. But I think we have begun that shift towards an approach where we treat nature as a sort of infrastructure, as critical infrastructure. And we see this in our updated climate change policy framework that recognizes nature-based solutions as actions that protect, conserve, restore our ecosystems, and produces benefits, socioeconomic benefits and resilience benefits for the entire population. We also see it in our national mangrove and swamp forest management plans that target 30% conservation of forest wetlands by 2033. Our national adaptation plan, which is currently being developed, also recognizes the use of nature-based solutions, and it's actually in the draft toolkit that we're now developing. Our updated NDCs, NDC 3.0, targets include reductions from land use change and forestry sectors. It speaks to mitigation co-benefits, the restoration of mangroves and seagrass ecosystems, etc. And if we're looking at the relationship between humans and nature, there is our beach access and management policy, which was recently tabled and still controversial, to increase access to the foreshore, to the floor, to the sea floor by the public, by fishermen, and to improve the standard of beaches available to the public. Looking ahead, I can also speak to the objectives coming out of our National Recovery Framework. Now, our National Recovery Framework actually commenced prior to the onset of Hurricane Melissa. We adapted that contract to just look at recovery frameworks or recovery plans for the parish. And one of the objectives coming out of our National Recovery Framework is to recognize the importance of natural ecosystems for risk reduction and recovery and prioritize environmental rehabilitation or restoration. And some of the indicators coming out of that report out of that framework is, for example, the number of priority sites with completed rapid ecological assessments. And this is according to our National Ecosystems Restoration Plan. The percentage of identified stakeholder databases that are integrated into a centralized database. That's one of the suggestions coming out of the framework. A database to guide restoration and rehabilitation of all of our ecosystems. The number of rehabilitation plans developed for priority sites, number of site-specific restoration plans developed for our priority sites are among some of the indicators. Having said all of this, however, I'm going back to something that Prof. Taylor raised, and that is our lived reality. When we look at nature-based solutions, we also have to think of what is our reality? Our reality is the uncertainty of these events. So nature-based solutions like mangrove restoration, for example, they take time to give us the protection that we need. So in the time that we are planting mangroves or restoring mangroves, we have seen it in one of our projects that we implemented as PIOJ. We plant the mangroves, but then here comes a storm and it removes the mangroves. And so we have to start all over again. That is our lived reality. So while we look at nature-based solutions, I'm suggesting that we think of a hybrid approach. So we think of a layered sort of protection when it comes on to building resilience. So we may have to use some hard structures, gray infrastructure to protect us or to help us transition into using these nature-based solutions, because our lived reality is that we are bombarded by these events, hydromet events, that sometimes work against nature-based solutions and the time they take to build resilience. 1 minute. Okay. All right. There are some recommendations, and I heard Dr. Tennant, right, mention some of them. We need to change the narrative. And that is also something that came out in our forensic analysis. With the help of UNDP, we are doing a forensic analysis of Hurricane Melissa, and we have the draft document. And one of the things that came out is just the difficulty of changing this narrative from crisis, because it is our lived experience, to this nature relationship aspirational approach. It takes a culture shift because it is what we're living. So we need to change the narrative to a more positive one, focus on green jobs, clean tourism, resilient agriculture, etc. But of course, there's a challenge there. Dr. Tennant spoke to investing in data and monitoring. She spoke to the challenges with just coming up with information to support the tracking and the monitoring of these indicators. It is a challenge. And so we have to invest in data monitoring. If we want to monitor the status of our ecosystems, we have to fund regular ecosystem health surveys, make these national indicators, adopt community-driven monitoring, maybe use our local forestry management committees to ensure that our local voices are included in the people-nature relationship. Also, we need to advance NBS across sectors, scale up proven nature solutions in agriculture, water management, etc., and integrate our nature-based solutions into post-Melissa rebuilding. So it may mean that we may have to change how we populate our NEOCs then. Instead of just having our response entities in the NEOCs, maybe we should look at having some of our climate scientists in there, or persons who can bring that perspective to see if whatever we're proposing in building back or building back quickly, because we're also fighting against the tyranny of the urgent. So it's easy to say, let's consider nature and having a relationship with nature. But when you are in the NEOC and you see your lifeline systems unraveling and cascading, then what you're thinking of is just restoring the status quo. So these are some of the things that we have to bear in mind as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Brown. Thank you so much for those comments, Dr. Tennant. Colleagues, I'm going to use Chair's prerogative, privilege, that's my word, and we're going to open up dialogue 3 and then circle back for any quick questions and comments. So we're going to invite Dr. David Smith forward, coordinator of the Institute for Sustainable Development and director of the Center for Environmental Management here at UWI Mona. He will speak to reciprocity, visions for Jamaica and Caribbean states on ways to restore, repair the relationship between society and nature. Colleagues, let's welcome Dr. Smith.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to start. 20 years ago, UNDP worked with the University of the West Indies to establish the Disaster Risk Reduction Center, which is this week celebrating its 20-year anniversary. So when we were talking, and people never mentioned, they mentioned the triple crisis, they didn't mention the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are waste, climate change, biodiversity loss, and inequality. We keep mentioning the inequality one in passing, but it is actually very much a big driver and is driven by the other horsemen. I also wanted to just make a note that when we were talking earlier on about the different indices to be added to the Human Development Index, a couple of points. One is that, as somebody pointed out, data are deficient. And so measuring whether nature is thriving or not is incredibly difficult. And so far, the sort of proxy measures I've been hearing are probably not going to be very useful for developing countries. And we need to be fully aware of that and bear in mind that if this is a measure that's going to be put out throughout, then it may very well have less relevance to several countries. The other point of that is something I remember being told by somebody who was a member of cabinet in one of the countries we worked in when I was at UNDP. And I was trying to sell the idea of doing the national human development reports, which was at that time, the thing. And, we go in there and say, well, human development index is really, really good thing. GDP per capita, not so great. And the question from the member of cabinet was, I really understand what you're saying, but why is it that our access to concessional funding is determined by GDP per capita and not this great HDI? Didn't have an answer for him, but I'm absolutely sure that somebody in the UN system now has an answer to that question. If not, then there needs to be one, because Nobel Prize winning scientists have told us time and time again that GDP per capita does not measure human development or prosperity. But we still treat it as if it does, simply because it's easy to measure, which is, the trap of ease of measurement, which then takes us over. One of the things as well we need to bear in mind is, before I get to the solution side, is that we tend to totally underestimate the ability and time it takes to recover from a cataclysmic event. So, for example, everyone remembers Ivan? Yeah, good. Ivan hit the Cayman Islands. 2 days later, I was in the Cayman Islands talking to people. I went back again 3 months later. By then, we'd done ADALA, the damage and loss assessment, the same document that took forever to be done here. And we found out that it was something like 220% of GDP. And they also said we worked it out as $75,000 per capita.
And I remember explaining that to the Premier, who immediately said to us, there are no Caymanians who can put their hand in their pocket and pull out $75,000 to rebuild. And we also found that if the Caymanians were going to build at the fastest rate they'd ever built in human history, it would still take them 6 years to get back to where they were the day before the hurricane hit. They lost 3,000 out of 3,500 hotel rooms in a single day. And one of the things they do in Cayman Islands is tourism. The other thing they do is that thing. So what is the per capita damage and loss for Jamaica due to Melissa? Hands up, anyone who knows. Okay, back of the envelope calculation, 12.23 billion US dollars divided by somewhere between 2.7 and 2.8 million people comes up to $4,500 per capita. So when you leave here today, go to the bank, get your $4,500 US dollars, give it to the government so that they can respond. I'm not seeing anybody saying, yes, I can do that. Yes, exactly. But I'm still not hearing, okay, it's going to take a while to recover. It's probably going to take at least 6 years. It'll probably take longer than that. And during that time, it's almost certain that we're going to get hit again. So we definitely can't do things like use schools as shelters. What we could do is do what Dominica did and go to the European Union and say, hey, look, we got completely screwed by another hurricane beginning with M. Does anyone remember what that one was? Right. And it was also a Category 5. So what they did was they got the European Union to build shelters. Those shelters had to be multi-hazard proof because Dominica is one of the most dangerous places on the planet to live. In addition to being subject to catastrophic floods from time to time, and it got hit by floods 2 years before it got hit by Maria, and being subject to tropical cyclones, it has 9 active volcanoes. Dominica is barely the size of Kingston and St. Andrew. Imagine if Kingston and St. Andrew had 9 active volcanoes. We wouldn't be here. We'd be living in Montego Bay or some entirely other country. But they managed to get that, and they built shelters around the island so that people could go to shelters the next time there was a problem. Why? Because traditionally, like many Caribbean countries, what they were doing for using shelters was to use either schools or churches. The churches were beautiful because many of them were built several hundred years ago. So naturally, they fell apart when the hurricane hit. So we may want to think of doing that. It's a useful example. One of the things we may also want to look at is CREED, which is I think they set up in the same way that we decided to go on the straight and narrow. They've set up something called CREED, the Climate Resilient Execution Agency for Dominica. And it lasted for 6 years because essentially its job was to try to rebuild Dominica after the cataclysmic event that was Hurricane Maria. And at the end, its job was to try to mainstream all the things that it had done back into the mechanisms of government. So government, as government, without it having all these extra bells and whistles because of the emergency, could, under normal circumstances, carry out the work it needed to do in terms of building resilience, repairing, and preparing for the next event. I saw, I think it was 2 days ago, in Dominica, they just got a $26 million US grant to work in communities such as Bagatelle, Good Hope, Petit Soufrière, Coulibistri, etc. It was interesting for me because colleagues of mine from the Department of Geography and Geology, working on a project that we had done with money from IDRC, had done work in looking at the exposure and vulnerability of communities in Dominica to rainfall, landslides that would have been triggered by excess rainfall, and landslides that would have been triggered by earthquakes. Did I mention they had earthquakes in addition to the 9 active volcanoes? Yeah. Okay, so basically we looked at the hazard, we looked at the exposure, we looked at their cultural practices, we had people go through and figure out all the different things that they were doing in terms of what made them vulnerable. And lo and behold, a couple of days ago, they managed to get 26 million US dollars so that they could start working in those communities. So we worked in Bagatelle, we worked in Good Hope, we worked in Petit Souffre. And it's nice to see that the work that was done by really weird scientists, because we actually had some social scientists there as well. We went into the communities, we found out what the vulnerabilities were, we worked through the whole thing, we gave them the answers to the government, and they were able to then take that, and they've been able to get money so that they can help the communities to do two things. One is build more resilient livelihoods, because they need to make their agricultural practices more climate resilient, but also to build more resilient structures inside those communities they live in, so that the next time that a hurricane or excess rainfall or one of the volcanoes goes off, they will be in better shape than they were the last time. And that was very interesting and very gratifying to see. So it is possible that if you take science and work it properly and pull in all the different disciplines and do transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary science, you can end up with solutions that will help people in the political sphere whose job it is to do policy, that the policies they do will be able to be done and people will live better and we'll be in a much better situation than they were had the science not been done. Let me see, was there one or two other things?
In your 5 minutes.
Yes. I did have a problem with the question. The way it was phrased, it said, ways to repair and restore the relationship between society and nature. And that implies that the relationship that society had with nature in the past was a good one. It wasn't. Don't for 1 minute think that because, 100 years ago, we weren't doing that much damage to the environment. We were. We ran the dodo to extinction. We killed off the passenger pigeon. We killed off an awful lot of animals and plants because they tasted good. So our relationship with nature has never really been harmonious. It's entirely possible that all the great things we say that indigenous people did simply worked because there weren't very many of them. So let us look for a good relationship with nature, but let's not romanticize about the past. I'll stop there because I think my minute has run out.
Whoa, what a way to end the dialogue. Gonna open up the floor and give you a chance, my colleagues. I think Prof. Taylor has a question for PIOJ. We can start there.
Thank you so much for answering.
I didn't really, but one of the common themes clearly has been data, and we recognize this, and we have recognized this for a long time. And yet, I still think that in the country, we have not stopped to have the dialogue, the collective dialogue about data across disciplines. What is needed? What are the gaps? Who is to collect what? At least that's, subset or basic. We just have not had that dialogue. And yet the data is so critical for both the rebuilding effort and the preparedness. I'm really throwing out a challenge. and I know the PIJ know that I've thrown the challenge to them before, But yeah, that's really the observation I would like to make.
Is a separate point?
Yes, I have a few
Okay,
points.
hello.
Sure.
Okay. And Prof. Mathur wants to say something on data as well.
Sure.
So I agree with Prof. Taylor, and we have occasionally in the past sat down and discussed data issues. For example, I know we had convened a special committee to just look at our boundaries, the administrative boundaries for health, education, and just standardizing that. And we get to a point and then it falls off. So I take up your challenge, and well, I agree that we do have to have that discussion. But I just wanted to respond to something that David Smith said, just to fix the narrative a little bit. So we didn't take long to do our dollar. Our dollar was done within the time frame required in our disaster risk management framework for the dollar. It was finished in December and submitted to the cabinet, and it's now on our website. Cayman Islands is a little bit different from Jamaica in terms of the size of the country, and so that would also have an impact on how quickly you could have that done.
What is taken? Dean, I'm coming shortly.
So something on data, and we've been analyzing SDGs and the role of the private sector. Regarding data, I think there has to be a radical shift and a social re-engineering happening here in Jamaica. We don't trust each other. We don't share data. We are very skeptical. So we have to really change the way we see data, the way we value data, and the way we share and use data for decision making.
Thank you so much. I went to a Caribbean dialogue and they were complaining about data as well.
Also, we have to make data freely available. There's way too many government agencies trying to sell you data that they use taxpayers' money to collect in the first place.
In and of itself, it's not useful unless somebody gets to analyze.
I just wanted to say that we're talking about data, which is absolutely correct. But when you look at the smaller territories, Jamaica is like a, gold standard where data is concerned, because we just don't have data. It's, it's very frustrating trying to do work on some of the smaller territories. But I think I had a few things that I wanted to say, and I don't know if
you're
I
going
could...
to have the floor after Nadine, so
yeah, true.
So the floor you'll have.
I can, well, maybe permit me to just say that I felt, okay, let me just answer, let me just talk about the last couple presenters. I think I am appreciating the point made by Dr. Tennant about the need for national capital accounting and the mainstreaming of nature-based solutions in planning and public finance and investment systems and national development planning. I don't think we've heard that kind of suggestion. Certainly I have not heard it. And I'm not saying that I sit in places where these discussions take place, but I haven't really heard it. I wondered whether local knowledge, I haven't heard any one of us so much talk about the valuing of local knowledge and local voices. I think that has to be part of this nature-planet relationship, because we know that local people have said to engineers and other planning bodies, do not put this whatever here. And we go ahead and we build, totally disregarding. And then rains come and they wash away whatever it is. And we're back to square one. And I think that the valuing of these voices is very important. I kind of feel that from the discussion, because I come out of sociology, where I come from, I kind of feel that a missing voice or missing voices from today are the voices of the social workers and the psychologists. As I've heard so many things where I felt, if my social work colleagues were here or my psychology colleagues were here, they would add and enrich. I'm not saying, though, that this is the last conversation that we're going to have, but their voices have to be important. Dr. Smith, when you spoke of what went on in Dominica, I recall, I think it was Maria, we had a social work student. I was in my home department of sociology, psychology, and social work. We had a student from social work who we had sent down under a Caribbean internship program. And Maria struck, and they needed her. She couldn't even come back up. The value she brought to the recovery effort, just working in communities. I mean, this young lady came back to us almost in December because we had to just lend her, suspending her semester for a bit and lending her. She came up exhausted and indicated how much social work and psychology, that capacity was just almost non-existent, and how much they needed there. And maybe the last thing I'll say for right now is I kind of feel I have been trying to get, going back to data, trying to get our country to appreciate how important time use data are for countries, not just for the measurement of SDG 5, particularly indicator 5.4.1, which is on unpaid care and domestic work, not just for that, but many other things. And currently, based on some work that I'm doing with a colleague, we are finding, we're looking at volunteerism, using the same time use work. And I want to say that there is time to care, time for care, and there is a big link with volunteerism. And I'm just wondering if in the Human Relationship Index, and one of those indicators, I don't remember which was it care for the environment, care for nature. If we could not get our country to agree around the importance of volunteerism around caring for the environment. I'll just say, leave that there for now. But I have a few other comments which I will make.
Thank you so much, Steve. Colleagues, I'm going to move us towards our final. Please forgive me, and I'm hoping that we can continue the discussion beyond. My last comments would be perhaps, I imagine Sir Kishan will speak to it, other avenues to give input, because it sounds like there's a lot more input that colleagues want to give than we can afford in this dialogue. Forgive me, sir, UNDP support for this data review that we're talking about. I know it also comes up under the Higher Education Task Force for the Disaster Resilience, and they're looking to have a disaster forum that Prof. Taylor has suggested maybe this summer. Is there any avenue to support there? And wondering if when this report comes out, do we take sections of it and do some simple products so that more people can take up the information coming out of? Just wondering if that is done. Not sure, sir. I would love to hear your comments there as well. Colleagues, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Ricketts for her final comments. She will use her 5 minutes to do those final comments. And Dr. Kishan will come in his 5 minutes to do comments, because we have to yield the room to another session after us. Thank you, colleagues, for joining together as Dean wraps up for us.
Just to say, I think that we've got off to an excellent start. I like the start so far. I think we made a number of Prof. Taylor's recommendations, the 3 perspectives, and you all know where I particularly have gravitated, which is the climate crisis being used as an opportunity for transformation. And I suppose transformation around things like data, transformation around how we do national accounting, the mainstreaming of the nature-based solutions, all of those kinds of transformations, and around some of the comments made by Professor Muthuri around, well, the virtuous cycle or circle that you presented, and also Kevin Williams, Dr. Williams' reminder of the education fallout and the intergenerational implications for intergenerational poverty. I think were important. Nadine, just you recommending the hybrid solutions is something which I had not even considered. As I appreciated the point very much that you made of how important that is. as we respond. I wanted to just add one thing which didn't come out, and maybe this is where it goes back to my well, it's not sadness, my missing the voices of my colleagues from social work and psychology. And maybe gender. The gender dimensions we haven't even spoken about at all. And that is very, very critical, because when we have these crises, they fall very heavily on women. Women and, yes, the boys, well, certainly in schools, when you look at the fallout in education, the boys who are missing are largely the boys, because they have gone into the labor market and they probably will never return. That's the intergenerational impact, the impact that it could have on just translating poverty down the road. But the impact on women in particular, the gender dimension is something we will have to pay attention to. And I want to say that, Judy, you talk about the implications also for children, and particularly girls, the sexual abuse of girls. Shelters, when we build these shelters, the shelters have to take into consideration privacy issues and protection of children, especially girls. So that has to be very important. And I think, Dr. Smith, you mentioned how important transdisciplinarity is to this discussion. And I think we are agreeing that transdisciplinarity, perspectives will have to be embedded into this discussion. Those, I would say, are my critical points, certainly in concluding. But maybe I should ask Dr. Cody, what would you want to see us do from here on? Maybe that's a question is it that you would expect from us another round of the dialogue, so that we can then have our gender specialists, our social workers, our psychologists, because I think they are important to this human-planet relationship. Yes, thank you.
Wow. That was really amazing. I mean, a really diverse set of perspectives and a really rich discussion, actually, on different aspects of that framework that was set out initially by our global director. So just firstly to say a huge thanks, to all the thought leaders that took the time to join for this dialogue in the super hyper busy schedule that I know many of you have. Thanks to colleagues online for joining, and we look forward to discussing further with everyone online and here in the room. So I think definitely, I'm not going to repeat all the bright ideas that really came out of that discussion. I think Dean Ricketts highlighted some of the key ones. I stuck with the third dimension from Prof. Taylor, Dean Taylor, and what that actually means in terms of shifting to transformation. What are those triggers, or what actually happens in those moments? Sometimes in some countries there are existential moments where there's a transformational shift. We've seen societies collapse over in the deep history of humanity and nature and society. We've seen lots of transitions, and so globally, of course, that's what we're facing. It's an existential threat to the future, as Prof. Taylor clearly mentioned. But then we also got a call to the fourth dimension from Prof. Northover. That kind of portal to something else, alternative models, right? And I think that's also quite critical. The focus on multidimensional poverty and really focusing on the people that are at the front lines here, that have been thrust into deeper situations of poverty and desperation in some of the communities that were hit. I think that that focus on non-linearity, the instability of human development as a concept, as a practice, I think that flux that comes out of that process, that rethinking process, I think that's quite critical from a global perspective to push that narrative. And I think these experiences from this setting is really important for that process. So thanks again. I think it's been will be valuable for the global process. The interdisciplinarity, and I think that theme that our global director put on, the narrative for the next global human development report on regeneration, restoration, some kind of reparatory process for people and planet. I think that's quite an important thread, I feel, that went through some of the discussions also. And how does that translate into both policy and practice, as of course, David highlighted very strongly. So yes, per capita, if we're going to look at the loss and damage of $4,500 per capita coming out of Melissa as a, I guess, initial estimate from a rapid loss and damage assessment. I mean, that's all it is that's in it. But what does that mean when you talk about lost opportunity or damage to things like human development indicators? What's going to be the hit for, Vision 2030 in terms of that social vulnerability, that inequality, whether it's inequality indices, gender coefficients, multidimensional poverty, what has been and what's going to be the long-term implications. What does this mean for already shaping the post-2030 agenda? Globally, that's obviously a process that's kicking off, but even within the Caribbean. Now, for the next steps, I think it would be quite important and useful to actually have some of the contributions actually integrated into the global process. So in other words, if there's interest, the initial thing would be to have a pool of these thought leadership pieces that can be submitted formally into the process, into the Global Human Development Report Office as contributions to the actual drafting of the Global Human Development Report. So as background papers into that. And this could be basically, I guess even briefs, basically, rather than full-on articles, but it could be even just briefs on to capture some of the key points that have been made here today as a cumulative contribution from the University of West Indies into this process. I think that would be something that would be quite timely and a good follow-up, impactful, let's say, so that when the drafters of that global report, really put front and center the small island developing states as on the front line of this issue. Vastly different concepts of these issues when we're talking about a major emerging economy, a long-standing industrial economy, or anybody else. It's really quite an important, unique context and that profile is important to really bring forward. Some of those questions that Prof. Taylor raised at the outset, but also that David brought at the conclusion. So that's one route. David mentioned, in the past we used to be big on national human development reports. That's whether it has to be a human development-oriented report or whether it's something that is a joint effort on some kind of a national report done together between UNDP and our partners. That could be a good contribution on that road to 2030 or looking ahead already to human and planetary futures post-2030. What does that mean? Capturing some of this kind of thought leadership. That could be interesting. And lastly, we're, of course, launching this year practically tens of millions of dollars of US dollars of new programming, specifically on green recovery. This nexus, this idea that development is no longer this linear pathway, but it's really can be defined as a socio-ecological system, and really trying to understand that in everything that might mean, but really trying to embed some of these ideas then into that programming, because a lot of that programming is not just about, it's not about hard infrastructure. A lot of it is technical assistance in terms of shaping assessments, studies, policies, new policies, working with communities, a lot of local grants to communities. And so I think engaging civil society on some of these issues So that's basically an opportunity to really put both policy and practice as a follow-up, thought leadership, but also in practice as a follow-up, I would say. And so I don't think this is definitely a one-off. I don't see this as a, so I look forward to discussing with everybody, actually, I mean, ideas for subsequent dialogues. Is it more engaging with CSOs and civil society as well, in terms of, you know, beyond the academy, as it were? I mean, to really engage, is it about engaging actual communities that you know, in the West, for example, or otherwise? I mean, various other discussions that approaches for further dialogues that could be useful. But thanks again on behalf of UNDP, and really thanks again for this strong collaboration with UE, for PIOJ, and for our partners, and hope this has been useful as well for the local research agenda.
With that, colleagues, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the organizers, the Faculty of Social Sciences. No problem. No problem. UNDP, thank you all, colleagues. Have a beautiful afternoon. Perhaps we may want a group photo. I don't know if that will help us as well in publicizing the activity. We could consider. Could we just invite you forward? Last request of your colleagues. Thanks, colleagues. Yes. Yes.